Yeah, like that. Hello? Hi! So we are about to start the author panel, which I'm super excited about. We have some great authors here, authors of banned books. Phyllis Naylor is a Newbery Award winner. I would love for people to come into this room. But we're not gonna start yet without doing a little more corralling, Anna. So
Testing.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Stoli-Persky. I'm a third-year MFA student in creative writing at George Mason University. Yay! Yay, George Mason! And I'm here to moderate this panel on our authors panel, who are going to be talking about banned books and how it affects authors. And I'm going to start with introductions for everyone. Can the people in the back hear me? Awesome. I like that. I'm going to start with Juana Medina. Juana was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. She's the author and illustrator of multiple children's books, including 'Twas the Night Before Pride, which is really awesome if you want to go take a look at it, and the book series Juana and Lucas. Juana's passion for storytelling has led her to work on exciting projects with a lot of clients, among them the Library of Congress and PBS. And next, I'm going to introduce Philip Reynolds Naylor, who was born in Anderson, Indiana, in a tiny house on Chestnut Street that her dad and grandfather helped build. She was making up stories as far back as she can remember. Her first story was published when she was 16, and she just turned in the manuscript for her 150th book. Right. She writes for both children and adults, but is best known for her young adult fiction. Her Shiloh series won a 1992 Newbery Award. Books in her Alice series are among the most frequently challenged books over the last decade. And finally, over here, we have JP Dervagogian, and JP is the host of the podcast, This Queer Book Saved My Life. I suggest everybody check it out. It's really awesome. Twice named new and noteworthy by Apple Podcasts, This Queer Book Saved My Life is listened to in more than 1,600 cities worldwide and has featured major literary lights in the LGBTQIA+ community. And a 2022 Lambda Literary Fellow, JP founded the Queer Armenian Library, which is the world's first and only library for books, film, TV, and art by and for and about queer Armenians. So, totally awesome panel. I'm super excited. I'm going to start with, we're all here because we want to talk about recent efforts to ban books by diverse authors and to celebrate stories and storytelling. I'm going to start with Phyllis, who has written so many books over the years, many of which have been banned for a variety of reasons. And Phyllis, can you tell us about the books that you have written and perhaps read a few selections and talk about why they were banned?
good to be here and know that I'm not going to be kicked out if I read something. A neighbor stopped by and showed me a pair of socks. All of these wonderful titles of books that have been banned and how it looks now. So somebody is profiting by this. In thinking over how many books of mine have been banned, I see that there are 4 reasons why they're banned. Not all of them. And it covered witchcraft was one, religion was another, swear words was another, and finally sex. And I'll just tell you briefly about one encounter, and then the others can tell about some of theirs. But my first encounter was when I was talking to a school, and in the library, and after everybody had gone back to their classroom, a woman sitting at the back came up and said, "Could I talk with you?" And I figured it was somebody's mother, and said, "Certainly." And we sat down at a library table, and she reached across and took my hand and said, "I love you, and Jesus loves you. So why are you writing all of those books about witches?" And she said, "Why are you writing all of those books about witches when there are all those people in California running around wearing necklaces made out of the bones of unborn babies?" For a moment, I was just speechless. And finally, I said, "Where are you getting your information?" And she said, "Pat Robertson's 700 Club." I said, "Have you read any of my books?" And she said, "No." I said, "Are you going to read any of them?" And she said, "No." And then she said, "But I'll pray for you." And that was my first introduction to censorship by this woman. The next one was, and that was Witch's Sister, and it came out in 1977, and it's still in print, which is... Then the next time, this one wasn't banned, I don't think yet, but they were asked to ban it. The Fear Place is about 2 boys with their parents who are on a science trip up in the Rocky Mountains, and the parents are called home for an emergency, leaving the 2 boys, 11 and 13, to take care of themselves. And the boys are having a squabble. And one of them is still working on things that his mother left for him to do. He's stuffing envelopes and putting stamps on them. And the younger boy, just to get his goat, said, "I peed on those stamps." And the older son is so angry at him, the silliness and all the rest, that he goes up in the mountains and doesn't come back. And the younger boy, who is afraid of heights, finally gets up his nerve to go and see what's happened to his brother. And the brother did have a broken leg, but a lot of exciting things happen in that book. And one parent wanted it banned because the younger boy said, "Pee." Then number 3, oh, that was the Fear Place. Number 3 was about a girl and her pastoral father. They live in West Virginia in a rural area. And a hippie community moves in not too far away, and a couple that this girl falls in love with has a newborn baby, and her father gives her permission to sit for this family. And she just has a wonderful time talking with them and caring for their baby. But the baby, I think he's 6 months old, and he dies suddenly of crib death. And the girl is just, she can't adjust to this. She doesn't know how to explain it. And she tells her father, if I can find it.
Here, I'm happy to hold the mic.
Yeah, thank you. She tells her father that she can't understand why God would allow such a thing. And he tells her that we'll know when we go to heaven, when Christ calls everybody to come at the end of the world. And she says, that doesn't work for me. I want an answer now. And the father says, you know, that you can teach something by having a child die. It gets a lot of people involved. They'll see this as God's handiwork because there will be something good out of it. And she said, why couldn't he let this baby grow up and be a fine example that way? But she disagrees with her dad, and who she's always loved. And that brings a real crisis in her life. And she finally has to decide that there are things she's going to have to figure out for herself and be her own teacher. And that was banned. Let's see. A man in Virginia wrote a letter to the superintendent of schools, to the principal of the high school, and to every member of the Board of Education, and he demanded that book be removed from the library. And the librarian said no, she was going to keep the book. And so there was this huge fight about it, sort of, and finally the man said in his letter that the book denigrated Christianity, promoted pagan practices, and subjected his Christian children to ridicule. And while it was all right for Evie to question her father's faith, she should have come around to his beliefs by the end of the book. And because she did not, he wanted it forever banned from their library. And the school refused, and the Board of Education stood with the librarian. And so the parent came to the library, picked up the book, took it home, and refused to bring it back. So he stole school property, and that's the last I heard of him. But his Christianity showed in the wrong way. And then there's sex. But I'm going to put that off and let somebody else talk for a while, and then we'll get around to that.
Sex. Thank you so much. Juana, you're both an author and an illustrator, and I was wondering if you could show us some of your books and maybe read a selection or two, and then follow up with your experience about your books being banned.
Happy to. First, I should acknowledge what an honor it is to sit right next to a trailblazer and an icon of children's literature. Thank you. Phyllis was saying a few minutes before we started, maybe I'll just take 5 minutes, and I was just thinking, take the whole hour, please. It is truly an honor to be sitting, sharing space with you, with both of you, the three of you. So I have 2 books banned right now, and one of them, given the current climate, we can tell why. It has rainbows, pervasive very scary rainbows. Terrifying. And it talks about pride and how dare I. So it was banned initially by Florida with the Don't Say Gay. KKK. And I had the pleasure of illustrating this book. The author is Joanna McClintock, who works at the LGBTQIA Center in Brooklyn. And so it is basically the story of a family where there's 2 moms and 2 kids, and they are preparing for Pride. So 'twas the night before Pride. It's basically the preparations for Pride. On the end papers, I decided to honor a number of pioneers of gay and queer rights because I felt even though they have had their own very difficult journeys, they had been brave enough to come out to the world and fight for our rights, and this was the smallest honor I could give them. And after drawing all these people, the publisher decided not to release the list. And it took forever doing the research, making sure they were all out, that I wouldn't be outing anyone, that they hadn't said anything that would be, harmful or that we shouldn't be. There it is. You can guess some of them because I can't release the list, which is really sad. But there's Freddie Mercury and there's Elton John and all sorts of Harvey Milk and so many people. And this book was a wonderful opportunity to honor, again, so many people that have come before me and have fought for our rights and ensured that families like mine can get married and have children and be protected by the law. And so even in the smallest details, I have, for example, the brooch. I don't know if you know, Edith Windsor fought for, was the plaintiff for gay marriage. And because she couldn't marry her wife gave her a brooch she could wear. And so I decided to draw it so even in the smallest vignettes, I was trying to make sure that there were some sort of nods to people within the community. The tattoos on this person tell so many stories that those that are banning books don't know about yet, but then they'll be scandalized very soon. And, details as simple as a monarch butterfly to give a nod to DACA, just dreamers, undocumented children, making sure that even a sticker for DC statehood is there. Yeah. And I took it very personally, and I wanted to make sure that there were little love pockets for people to find. And so I drew Orthodox Jews at Pride, imagine, how dare I? And I drew Muslim families, and I drew adoptive families that have been built through adoption, and male babysitters. And, made sure to speak about violence in Latin America and make a t-shirt that stands against it with the Ni Una Menos, which is such an important movement started in Mexico and Argentina, through the 2 main corners of Latin America. And then took some delight in illustrating some of the policemen raiding Stonewall by basing myself on illustrations made by Tom of Finland. So, took some serious license there. And I did plenty of research trying to figure out where the police come from the night of the raids, and how tall would the trees on Christopher Park would be, and what would the moon phase on that historic night of June of 1969 would be, even though we ended up cutting the moon out of the illustration. That is the amount of detail that is within the pages of this book. And making sure the uniforms were right, making sure that all the details on every illustration. So many people have wondered, why did I draw someone with a port on their arm? Is that port for hormones or for diabetes or for cancer? And they need an answer. And My answer is I have 2 young neighbors with ports in their arms, and I wanted them to feel reflected in a children's book. And to make it even worse, I drew my family in the book. My sons, who couldn't care less about any book I work on, are for the first time extremely proud to share that they are in a book. They are 6-year-old twins, and having 2 moms, they often do not find themselves in books. And when we go to bookstores, they're looking for books about dinosaurs or planes or anything that doesn't have to do with traditional families because they cannot see themselves within it. Same with TV shows. So for the first time, they could point to the book and say, I'm right there. And we actually have, thanks to the generosity of the organizers, some posters of this last page where you might recognize some figures there. So these books matter greatly, at least to some of us. And I think we could be louder about it. The other book that is banned is Juana and Lucas, which is semi-autobiographical, and how dare I write about a brown girl growing up in Colombia and having Spanglish. So it's banned in Florida, Minnesota, and it's being debated in some schools in my home state of Virginia.
Wow, thank you. JP, you've interviewed a number of authors as part of this Queer Book Saved My Life podcast. Can you tell us about why you started the podcast and what you hope it's accomplishing?
Was your book really banned in Minnesota? Because I live in Minnesota, and we'll fix that.
Thank you.
First thing on Monday.
I received a letter from We Need Diverse Books, I think 1 or 2 weeks ago, talking about how it's being brought up to discussion at some boards. You know, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay. So I started the podcast because I wanted to hear more from my community about what are the books that are life-giving, what are the books that are saving them, because we're facing, right, as we all know, coordinated attacks on every level of government, from school boards all the way up to the Supreme Court, and including increases in hate crimes. And so I wanted to know, what are these books so I can help be a conduit to getting them in the hands of people who might need them. And on the show, we deliberately don't define what saved means. We recruit guests from across the rainbow and let them define what saved means for them. So for some, it's about finding the language to come out. For some, it means they now have a roadmap to begin their gender affirmation process. For others, it's about processing an abusive relationship. And what does that look like? You know, in the queer community, we tend to valorize relationships, and we don't want to talk about what abuse can look like in them. And so, you know, this was actually, the book that we talked about is out there, In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. And then something that I wasn't expecting but it made total sense, was how the characters, either in fiction or if it was memoir, the author, were actually standing in as emotional supports, right? There was one who was talking about how the book was standing in for an older brother for him, and there was one that was like, I hadn't met my queer friends, and so these were my queer friends until I could actually, you know, leave the house and go and make queer friendships of my own. And so I think that's why we started the podcast. And there are thousands of book podcasts, and there are dozens of LGBTQ book podcasts, and they're all like, you know, what's a fun beach read, or what's, you know, just like a new thriller. And I was like, no, I need to know the books that are saving someone's life so we can hold them up and say, read this.
Wow. As a follow-up, what are some stories you've heard from authors you've interviewed who've been banned, and sort of what is the effect of that on them?
So I have notes here because it's a podcast, and if I could bring audio clips, I'd bring audio clips. But I'm going to read some stuff out, right? So one story that I want to start with is from an author named Zaylor Stout. He wrote Our Gay History in 50 States. And I want to start with Zaylor because on the show, he set out very perfectly what queer people are facing, right? And he said, one of the realizations that came to me was the privilege that I had being black that wasn't there for me as being LGBT. I didn't learn Black history in schools because they didn't teach Black history in my schools, but I was still able to learn Black history at home from my family, my parents, my extended family. But queer kids aren't raised in queer homes. And so where is it that we're supposed to be able to learn our history? Even as adults, you stumble around. When I was in high school, I was digging around through the archives at the library, trying to see if there was anybody like me, and stumbling upon Black writers like Langston Hughes and Courtney Cullen, and being like, wait a minute, but you have to piece those things together on your own. The second story I want to share briefly is from Nancy Agabian. She is the author of The Fear of Large and Small Nations, but she was on the show to discuss In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. Please buy it out there. It's an amazing book. And she shared with me, for me, I think the main saving feature was seeing a silent part of myself represented. So, you know, you're feeling trapped, not knowing that I was in an abusive relationship, but seeing the portrayal of that helped me feel less alone and less ashamed, and having that feeling of, damn, why couldn't I have read this book when I had been living this? You know, that feeling of when you read a book and you feel like, I wish this had been a conversation I could have had with someone. And finally, I want to share a story from Rachel Cady. She was on the show to discuss Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. And the book literally saved her life, like quite literally. She said, I'm a trans woman, and I started my transition in 2017, which is otherwise known as the year I almost didn't make it through. I reached a point in that year where I was at a crossroads. I was either just going to keep on living or not be here anymore. Through a whole bunch of friends and support, I finally went to see a therapist, and in the course of that therapy, I found Whipping Girl. For the first time, I saw someone who was like me, and it was so validating. It was incredible. It was an epiphany for me because I realized at that point what I was feeling was valid. And finally, I was able to give myself permission to be myself.
So you're all very acquainted with storytelling, and I would like to hear from each of you what do you think is the importance of hearing from diverse authors, and even if the stories that they're telling make people feel uncomfortable at times, why is it important to hear those voices? Phyllis, I'm going to start with you.
Libraries or
Yeah, why is it important to hear from diverse authors? What, even if when it makes us feel maybe a little uncomfortable, or some people a little uncomfortable, why are those voices still important to be heard?
I think being uncomfortable is the point. Being exposed to just different things that you didn't expect, and see that people disagree on certain things, and you can still be friends and disagree on certain things. I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at.
No, that's a great answer. Juana?
Very much within that vein, I think success in life can be measured in our ability to take part in difficult and challenging conversations, uncomfortable conversations, in loving and caring and empathetic ways. And I often fear we think of diversity as out there, but when diversity is at our dinner table, when we are diversity, it's just, how can we not tell stories of how we belong in the world? It's that simple. And so this need to create fear around othering causes tremendous damage society-wise and towards the future and for our children. And so what I feel is we have made such an effort for years to bring everyone to the table, and they have recognized that our work has mattered and has made progress, and that we are seeing future generations grow with a more empathetic notion of self and towards others, and they realized, oh my goodness, we're losing our fertile ground to just instill fear. And so, yeah, we need those books.
Yeah, I've seen that too with children who are so much more empathetic, and I feel that books and diverse authors have brought them that. JP?
My first response when I saw this, I was like, get over yourselves. No, I mean, I was like, I don't want to read any more books about straight people having sex. I found that profoundly disturbing. But no. And this, so I guess as I was thinking more about it, and I come from clearly a storytelling culture, which is why I have my notes here, so I don't go on and on and on. But I was thinking about, as a queer person, I could say that because of my own spiritual abuse and spiritual trauma growing up, that kids shouldn't learn religion before they have their brains developed, right? Like, how can they understand the impacts of that and the joy of that? I could argue that. On the flip side, as an Armenian, I could say I am deeply uncomfortable not teaching Christianity to Armenian kids because it had such an important impact on our culture, and our culture is being erased left and right. It's being erased in the Middle East, it's being erased in Southwest Asia, it's being erased here in America. And so I think for me, as I was thinking about this, was that we have this kind of two competing ideas of liberty that's actually undergirding this. And some of us believe that liberty is like a radically true and free press, right? That if I don't like a particular book, I don't have to read it. I know that some people took the time to write it, and it has value to them, and if I don't like it, then I can just move on, and it might actually have value to me later on in my life when I come back across it. But how we navigate the being uncomfortable is what are the frameworks that we can put together that allow us to have life, love, and the pursuit, right, of happiness. Because queer people are already uncomfortable. People of color are already uncomfortable, right? What are those frameworks that come together? The other competing idea is that censorship is liberty. The organization Moms for Liberty, right, is just the recent example of this. This belief that unless I have the power to create a library that has no gay people in it, that has no people of color in it, then somehow I am not free. And so if there's a queer book in that library that I don't like, then I'm no longer free. So freedom for me is the power to erase queer people from my community so that I don't hear them anymore, I don't see them anymore. And to me, that's subjugation, right? It's subjugation of marginalized people, but it's also self-subjugation. Now, the question, I guess, is who's going to win? And I think hopefully we will, but we'll see.
Well, along those lines, I want to hear from each of you about what you think about the efforts to ban books, why they've increased in recent years, and what you think the effect is, which I think we started to touch on, but I'd like to hear more. Would you want to?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question.
What do you think the effect is of these recent efforts to ban books? How do they affect our culture as a whole, or individuals?
Sometimes it energizes the community to support, really come out and support a book. And this happened with Shiloh, and I realized that I didn't mention Shiloh. This is the book that won a Newbery Award. And down in Louisiana, a teacher had been using that with great success in the classroom. And it concerns an 11-year-old boy who takes in a dog that its owner has been mistreating. And the owner rages. He's mean to all of his dogs, but it's part of the community story. And when the dog comes away again to this boy to be rescued, the boy hides it and doesn't let the community know that he has it, doesn't let his family know that he has it. And when the secret comes out, the bad guy rages and rages about it. And while he's raging, he says, damn, and he says, I forget the other word that he used, along that line. And at a school board meeting, two parents stood up at the very end and said to the superintendent, did you know that your 6th grade or 5th grade teacher is reading a book to the class that has 2 swear words in it? We don't permit swear words in our family, so we want that book removed. And or we don't want him to finish reading the book. And the superintendent, caught off guard, said, well, I'll make sure that that book is taken out of the library. And then the school board was over, and the principal and the teacher who was teaching it came up and said, that's been our most successful book. I've had it year after year, and the kids love it. And well, he had already said publicly he would have it removed, so he said, we've got to do it, we've got to just stop it. Well, it was such an uproar that they made their weekly newspaper for, I think it went on for 3 or 4 months, and I wrote a rebuttal, and it was just, they had a school fair, and they weren't allowed to sell Shiloh, and so somebody bought and sent a huge box of Shiloh to the book fair. And so they sold out, and finally the superintendent said, okay, you can bring the book back, but from now on, any teacher that wants to read a book that might be controversial has to write a letter to all the parents in the class, tell them why it might be confrontational, and get them prepared for it. And I thought, was this a win or a loss? I mean, the poor teachers. But as far as I know, they're still teaching Shiloh in Louisiana.
But that is a great example of sort of the effect that sort of pulling these books back can have on teachers too, who want to bring out these books. JP, what are your thoughts on the effect of sort of banning books?
When I was thinking about this, we know that representation is important, right? And you know, Juana, your book is all about representation and seeing ourselves, right? And kids seeing themselves in this book, and that's important. As I was thinking about it, I kind of came at it from a different angle, right? And it was a 5th grader who taught me what the word fag. It was a 6th grader that punched me for the first time, perceiving me to be that, right? And so we have these kids who found out about the word, who knew it was okay to be violent about this. The adults came later. It was the kids that it was happening first, right? And this is not a story that's unique, I don't think. Well, hopefully it's not unique, and I was the only one. But next week, I'm actually talking on the podcast to an author, Chris Tompkins, who literally, and the title of the book is Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground. And the publisher is claiming that is the first book on preventing homophobia, transphobia, and bullying for school-age kids, and it's 2023. Now, the publisher is claiming that. I can't completely verify that. And so I think that having these books also doesn't combat the violence that can happen in these schools. And so are we training allies? Are we training, you know what I mean? If we're not doing that, not having these books in there allows for the parents to indoctrinate their kids to say it's okay to use these words, it's okay to use violence, to marginalize these kids, whether they're queer kids, whether they're, kids of color. And so I think for me, that's one of the another level of tragedy beyond not having the representation, right, in our schools.
That's a really good point. Juana, what about you? What do you think the effects of banning books are?
I remember the author of 'Twas the Night Before Pride sharing a video of someone completely irate at Target with a copy of the book and saying, "Look at this book! It's," and he opens the book and goes through 2-3 pages and closes the book and then stops the video saying how outrageous it is. And I was telling her, there is the problem. We have very serious problems with literacy. People are not reading enough. And, at Mason, doing research on literacy, early literacy, dual language learning, it comes very, very clear that apparently 27% of Americans adult Americans are illiterate. 40% of households in the richest nation of the world do not have books. And that includes phone books and cookbooks. To me, it is tremendously scary to think that we are okay with that scarcity and we are okay with that lack of access. And so I think the problem is rooted in misinformation and some people benefiting greatly on this and realizing the power and the high contagiousness of fear and taking profit of that. So I think we need to combat it with kindness and with early literacy and with access to books. Yeah.
Yeah, kindness. I think in the news we've seen a bunch of cases recently of books being banned. There's been, from pretty much every state. And I'm wondering if there's one incident that you've seen in the past couple of years that really sort of got to you, that really made you see the largeness of the problem or sparked a specific concern. JP?
There are ones that, like, I guess for me, and I'll talk about one later this afternoon that happened in Virginia. I think for me, it's the cumulative effect that really gets to me. Knowing that there's one. I mean, I didn't realize that it was 11 people. Is that what Andrew said? Like, most of them are from 11 people. I mean that. But the idea of it being a wave, that it's everywhere, that it's permeating all of our schools and either the school boards or the library boards. I mean, that to me I think has been the cumulative effect of it has been the part that really gets me down.
Phyllis, do you have one specific case that you can think of that really sort of upsets you particularly that you want to highlight?
No, it's the whole thing that used to be that librarians had more respect and teachers had more respect, and it just seems that so many of them just want to make a noise, and if it weren't this book, it would be another book, and because then they win, and because they're making so much noise, so then another happens in another school, and it's just, I'm upset by the whole thing, really.
Juana, do you have any specific one, or is it cumulative too?
I think it is cumulative, and also I think the hardest thing for me to stomach is our strange ability to stay quiet about it. That is what I'm particularly concerned and confused by. I think we all have the ability to speak and do more about it, just rather than being quietly and silently enraged. Yeah.
So, perfect segue to the question, what can all these people out here, what can readers and lovers of books or people who appreciate art of any kind, what can we do to fight back? Like, in your experience, what is there to do, to sort of mobilize and to make our voices known, that we want to hear all these voices and we don't want our books banned? Juana?
Engage in conversation. I think it starts in the smallest of ways. Reserve these books at the library and make sure that they have transit and that they are wanted and that they're being looked after. Buy these books if possible, or help support them. Also, if you have the possibility of attending school board meetings and speaking out, do so. And do so countering all that fear and anger, to speak with calmness and kindness and openness, and show them that we are not threatening and scary, and rather we want more space for everyone. There are also important efforts from We Need Diverse Books, from PEN America, from Faulkner, from Freedom, spelled F-R-E-A-D, Freedom. There you go, you have the perfect t-shirt, yes. So I think there are very many ways to support and be vocal, and yeah.
Well, sometimes book banning helps, and now it's ready for my sex part. But,
Go for it.
but I once got a letter from that began, "Did you ever think that a 41-year-old man would fall in love with your Alice books?" And he said, "I just recently read that a book called Lovingly Alice was banned from a school library." And he said, "Every time I read that a book is banned, I immediately go out and either buy it or read it." And so I'm going to read you something from Lovingly Alice. I began writing the Alice books, I don't know, decades ago. And I was just writing about a girl who's 8 years old, and she lost her mother when she was 4, and she's being raised by her patient father who lives in Silver Spring and owns a record store, and her older brother who finds her a handful. And it became, this is Lovingly Alice, but the first book was, I can't remember, but it had Alice in the title, and it became so popular that I thought, I'll just start a series about her, and she'll get older in every book, and I'll follow her and just have a good time, which is what I did. And I wrote one book a year, one Alice book a year, and then in the other half of the year I wrote something else. And it took me 28 years to write 28 books, one a year, and it takes her from age 8 up until she's going on her 60th birthday by jumping. And so there are people that have followed her all the way through, and I hear from them frequently. But in this book, Lovingly Alice, she and her 5th grade friends are on an overnight, and they're looking at a menstruation booklet that was passed out at school to all the 5th grade girls. And it talks about when that every month the girl will lose a bit of blood, and it talk about it, unless there's a sperm that joins it and makes a baby. But it never tells how the sperm gets inside of the woman. And so these girls are trying to figure it out on their overnight. And one of them says,
I'm happy to hold the mic.
pardon?
Do you want me to hold the mic while you read?
I think I can manage. One of the girls says she thinks she heard that the man puts it in her, that the penis goes in the vagina. And the other girl says, my parents would never do that. So they have this decision that one of them will find out the real answer. And of course, Alice is appointed to do that. And she's to come back on Monday and at recess and report to the other girls what she has learned. So she's trying to figure out how she can bring this up at the supper table and not sound like a geek. And so I'm going to read you what happens. Her older brother is named Lester. That night, Lester browned the hamburger for chili. I cut up the green peppers and onions, and Dad made some cornbread. When we sat down to eat, I remembered what I was supposed to ask, but I didn't want Dad and Lester to think I didn't know anything. I know all about sex, I began. I saw Lester roll his eyes. Dad looked up. What? I mean, you don't have to start at the beginning, I said. You don't have to tell me everything. That's good, said Lester, because I sort of wanted to talk about basketball. I ignored him. I know that it takes a man and a woman to make a baby, but I don't know exactly how the man gets his sperm inside the woman, I said. With a glue gun, said Lester, and took a bite of cornbread. Les, said Dad, and then he cleared his throat. I don't know why it is that I can't get a simple answer to a simple question instead of a lot of throat clearing and the whole history of the human race. When a man and woman want to start a family, Dad began. Please don't start with buying a house, I said. Yeah, Dad, cut to the chase, said Lester. So Dad speeded it up. People who love each other want to get their bodies as close together as possible, and when that happens, the man puts his penis inside the woman's vagina. And out comes the sperm, I asked. Something like that, said Dad. Like pee? I asked. Not that much, said Dad. For crying out loud, I'm eating, Lester complained. Sounds messy to me, I said. I thought about it a minute. Where do they do it? In the bathtub? Over the toilet? Lester bolted back in his chair. I don't believe this, he said. Then he hunched over his plate again. They do it out in the backyard, Al, and hose themselves down afterward. Lester, Dad said, she's asking some basic questions here. They do it in bed, Alice. People make love in bed. Oh, I said, all over the sheets? It's not as messy as you think, Dad said. And what mess there is doesn't matter. Oh, I said again. I wondered if there was anything else the girls wanted me to ask. How long does it take? I asked. Just a few minutes, or as long as a couple wants it to last, Dad said. Now about those Boston Celtics, Lester began, and then he and Dad talked about basketball. As soon as the bell rang for recess on Monday, Jody and Dawn and Megan and Rosalind followed me around the school and back to the teacher's entrance where we huddled together on the steps. Did you find out? Asked Jody. I nodded and told them everything Dad told me. I can't believe it, said Megan, thinking, I guess, of her parents. Then that's how they got my sister. And you, I said. We sat in hushed silence. Let's don't tell anyone else, said Dawn. Let's be the only girls in 5th grade who know. I just can't believe it, Megan said again. It's how everybody gets born, Megan, I told her. Mrs. Swick and Mr. Dooley, too. The principal, the president, Moses even, said Jody. But not the Pope, said Megan. Even the Pope, I told her.
Wow. And so that was banned also and challenged in different
Oh,
places?
yes. Oh, I didn't finish the story. I got a letter from a woman that began, and it had big letters across the top, "How dare you?" And she said, my daughter came home from school with a picture of a very innocent-looking girl on the front. And then she came to me in tears because of the penis-vagina thing. And she said, I wanted to wait until she was in 6th grade and then sit down with her with the Bible and tell her that intercourse was God's way of populating the earth. And now you've ruined it for her, and all she can get out of her mind is the penis and the vagina. And you've just ruined it for something. And I realized that to her, this was to be an important event in this child's life. And I had ruined it for her for this. And I wrote back and said, if she's 10 years old, she's certainly seen pregnant women and wondered what that was all about. And she's known that there's a baby in there. And I'm just surprised that she never asked you about it, because I was 9 when I asked my mother, and those were exactly the questions I asked my mother. I can still remember it, and those were her answers, but I did not have a big brother who was ruining it all for me. But we corresponded then, the mother and I, and she said, she just asked about it, and I asked about her and her relationship with the daughter, and she said, oh, my daughter can ask me anything except sex, obviously. So whenever I can, first of all, when girls write to me, and I get hundreds and hundreds of letters from girls, and especially about the sex thing. And that makes me feel pretty good that we can, but I always say, have you asked your mother about this? Have you talked to your mother? And invariably the answer is, she won't tell me. She wants to know why I want to know. She says she'll tell me when I'm older, so I figured I could ask you. And I don't go any further than what she really wants to know. And but that's, I think, why the Alice books are so popular.
Wow, that's a tremendous story, and now I'm super distracted. I'm going to read all the books. But to close out, JP, I was just wondering if you could talk to the folks here about what people can do to sort of fight all these book banning efforts, and what your thoughts are on that.
Not to plug my afternoon session, but we do have a really weird paradox happening right now. We have the most book bans that we've ever had in the country, and yet we have record LGBTQ fiction sales. So how do you, yeah. So I think when we say go buy a book, I mean, that's not actually an easy thing to do for queer books. I mean, this is actually, we're kind of living in if you look at the 90s as the first golden age, then we're kind of living in a new golden age where you can literally, from young adult and children all the way up, there's a lot to choose from. And that's why I think that asking and buying books is going to be a huge thing to continue to demonstrate to retailers that there's a market for this. And I think this is also really important because of what just happened. You asked me earlier about an egregious event. This might actually, now that I think about it, be my egregious event. There is a legislator in Virginia that is suing Barnes & Noble and trying to extend to Barnes & Noble the idea that to sell a kid's book, you need the parent to buy it. Now, what retailer is going to go through that, right? They're not going to do that. And so what the easiest thing to do would be, I'm just not going to carry the book anymore. So I think that doing things in retailers and demonstrating that there's still going to be a market, and even and I feel like I'm plugging the podcast all the time, but literally 2 weeks ago, I was interviewing the founder of Drag Queen Story Hour. And I think that, we were talking afterwards about the importance of not just doing those at libraries, but doing them at retailers to show them that there is still a market for this, that we want to be here, that there is, that is there. And so I think that this is going to be a really important thing about that. Something else I would say is that take the top 10 or top 13 list from PEN America of the banned books. Go to your library, whether it's a kid's school library or a public library. If the book isn't there, you can file a request for it to be there, right? Give those requests in there. That's a really easy thing to do. Just be here's the list. Is it in my library? You get some of them you can just put online, the forms now, so you don't even have to leave your home. You can just do it. You can look up the books there, and then you can send it in. But I think that demonstrating that is really important. And I think also recognizing, like with Drag Queen Story Hour and Drag King Story Hour, is that a little bit of these book bans are them being on the defense. right? And so it's not always necessarily an attack. It's them kind of responding to what the gains that we have been making. And I think sometimes we see all the bands and we focus on those, and the record sales gets lost in that conversation because sometimes we may be too focused on the bands, which, yes, stay focused on the bands, I say at a band books festival. But we are making a lot of gains in there as well. So I think anything that you can do to keep the market going, to demonstrate that there is a market for that, because a publisher houses right now, they'll do only 3 or 4 books a year. They're not doing a lot. They're doing a lot of gatekeeping still. But there are so many publishers that are doing that now, that now we have a huge plethora of books to choose from. And even, you know, in rural Minnesota, rural, you know, Wisconsin, which is where, you know, I live, book retailers now will carry a section of that because they see that there is a market. So I think continuing to have that market is really important.
That's brilliant. Thank you. First, I just want to thank this amazing panel. Thank you so much for being here. I think we all learned a lot today. So now we're breaking for lunch. Good time to visit the tables outside, and you can learn a variety of ways to get involved over there, and also buy some books. Loyalty bookstores out there, and they have a bunch of really interesting books. You can stop by registration. There's handouts, a raffle, and instructions for a social media action that involves putting banned books into the little free libraries. And then come back after lunch because we've got Congressman Raskin here, and that's pretty awesome. Thank you all for being here. Oh, there are food trucks outside, so I know I'm hungry, so figure you all are too.
Phyllis, I just had to tell you a story. When I was a little kid, my mom got me a book to try to give me the facts of life. It was called A Baby is Born. I still remember the title. And I read it with interest. It skipped over the part about how the semen gets into the vagina. It explains the semen and the egg release and all of that, but doesn't say how it gets in there. And I picked up on that as a little kid. And